Welcome everyone to our talks on the four books. Today we'll continue on our study of the highest learning. Last week we discussed how everyone has this moral excellence. It's innate and it's equal to the excellence and virtue of heaven and earth. So Mother Nature provides us with unconditional care and development, and we actually have this moral excellence as well. So this is manifesting the enlightened virtue, and that occurs in our daily moments. When we can do this, we can then help others also manifest their innate potential for goodness. The ultimate goal then is to achieve an effortless connectedness between ourselves and others, which is utmost goodness. So that's where we ended last week, discussing these aims of the highest learning. And this week, we'll talk about how to achieve this. So we'll start with the 6-step process and also talk about the 8 different actions. So that's the next passage. It states, know where to rest, and then there is certainty. With certainty, one can then be tranquil. With tranquility, one can then be content. With contentment, one can then contemplate. Contemplate, and then one can attain. So clearly, this sentence is a bit different from the previous in that you can see that there is a sequence of steps. So we can represent this in diagrammatic format. So in the chart on the right, it's Professor Liebengnann's chart, and he also represents it as a linear sequence from right to left. Here in my linear sequence, it starts from the top, knowing our goal, knowing where to rest, then having a certainty, and then ultimately achieving progress on the way. So 6 steps altogether. The first step is always the most significant. So let's look at that. Know where to rest. When we think about this, we immediately connect it with that idea of resting in utmost goodness. But in actual fact, for most of us, it may involve manifesting enlightened virtue first. That's the first milestone before we can love all others and help them uncover their innate potential. So firstly, for us, the goal is manifest enlightened virtue. Now notice that it states know where to rest. And that's being mindful and aware of the goal. In fact, this is actually quite significant because most of us may go through life without ever knowing that we have this enlightened virtue, without ever knowing that there is this possibility. Many may go through life wondering about the meaning of our existence. But when you read these classical texts, oftentimes the opening passage provides us with direction. So know where to rest is actually quite significant. And we also have to remember, of course, that these texts, the 4 books, the 5 classics, were core curriculum for government officials. There was training to become a government official, not a full-time student or they didn't go and live on a mountain retreat. They actually had to pin down full-time work. So these texts and the mental strategies and tools that we find in these texts were actually to help a government official navigate through a very complex bureaucratic work life. So in other words, they were undertaking the highest learning at the same time as their busy work schedule. Now that sounds like us, doesn't it? We might have a bit busy study schedule, work life, or even family life. But the way of highest learning is actually part and parcel and integral to our lives. So when we become aware of it, we should also realize that it's actually achievable as well. Now, when we read these terms like utmost goodness or enlightened virtue, sometimes it might be overwhelming because they seem quite big, these goals. But just like the little kid here in the photo, how does he climb to the top of the stairs? One step at a time. And for us, the way of the highest learning is really just an accumulation of small goals, small habits. We simply need to understand one instruction guideline, practice this one instruction. And the more we practice, the more confidence that we will experience. The more confidence we experience, the higher we will reach, and we will finally achieve this manifesting enlightened virtue. So this first step is very important. Now, rather than talk about the 6-step process in a theoretical way, I thought we could use a worked example, use something that we're very familiar with. It's from the Dizugui. This particular guideline states, some people like to gossip and comment about the faults or good points of others. But if something does not concern us, we should not get involved. So regardless of whether you're at school, university, or at work, there's always politics. Now, for example, if you're working in a hospital, in the staff rooms, the nurses will complain about the doctors will complain about the management. But is any of this actually productive? It's actually counterproductive because it creates divisions in the workplace. It creates this us versus them mentality. And at the end of the day, everyone should be working to improve and better patient care. If you're in a learning environment, everyone should be working together to improve scholarship. So what do? Well, if we take this as our small goal on this path of manifesting our enlightened virtue, then we follow what it says. If something doesn't concern us, we shouldn't get involved. So that's knowing the goal, knowing where to rest. So let's pretend this is our small goal. Now, once we have this goal, once we know about it, once we're mindful, then we can be committed. And that's the next phase, which is to be determined to achieve this goal. Now, the first phase is always difficult. You might be quite forced and unnatural because, let's face it, everyone or most people like to chit-chat. And inevitably, the conversation turns to the merits and faults of others. So when we first start out, we have to be very conscious about what we're saying, where the conversation is turning, and who we talk to. We may even have to avoid certain people who like to gossip and chit-chat. So while we make these changes internally, we'll notice that the people around us will react. Now, regardless of what they say, think, and do, we should remain unmoved and continue to be committed to this goal. So, for example, what might happen, if you stop for sort of gossiping with someone, they might think, are you still on their side? Are you still their friend? They might avoid you, ignore you, and talk to someone else who likes to gossip. In terms of changes in circumstances, they might not select you to be part of their team because they want to have someone from their own clique be part of their team. So it's going to be difficult. You want to make changes, you want to improve, but there's going to be resistance. So at this particular point in time, it's always useful to have to talk to a family member or a friend who's outside the organization, who can sort of remind you and encourage you that there's every cloud has a silver lining, that there's better days ahead. And we'll see exactly that in the next phase. So after this period, if you continue being determined, you achieve a sense of tranquility. Now, this is when you're much more settled in your thoughts. You don't have these distracting thoughts about what others think, what they're saying, what they're doing, and you're much more focused on your own self and how you're going to go about this particular task or goal. So it's sort of a peace internally. And that's very different from peaceful surroundings. So, for example, if we go on a holiday retreat, we might find the first few days refreshing, but after that, We might want to surf the internet, talk to friends, and that's because our mind is unsettled. True serenity comes from within, and it doesn't matter where you are, whether in the hustle and bustle of work life, you will still remain quite settled in your mind, and that is being at peace internally. Now, how does this come about? Well, it comes about as this third stage because you're at peace with the decisions in your life. In relation to our example, you're quite sure that you've made the right decision to avoid these toxic relationships and these negative people who bring out the worst in you, who bring out, narrow-mindedness and pettiness in you. So by avoiding these people, you actually, feel like you've made the right decision. And that leads to this tranquility. So much more settled. Now, if you continue, the next phase is a sense of contentment, when you feel quite at ease and quite happy in your practice and your learning. And that's because you're not motivated anymore by, sticking rigidly to the rule book and adhering to the rules and guidelines. You are actually self-motivated now because you feel the benefits. Your mind is clearer. You've blocked out this noise of these distracting, petty concerns and petty people. And so your mind is more settled to be more sincere, to be more sensitive to the people around you, and know how to relate better to the people around you. And then it becomes quite second nature to even be committed to this goal. It feels effortless at this point in time. Now, if you continue, you'll reach the stage of having very clear and detailed contemplation of your learning and your practice and the way of the highest learning. Now, if you look at this photo here, you'll notice that the water very clearly reflects the mountain scenery. Now, why is that? Because the waters are still. Now, if our mind is settled, it doesn't have these distracting thoughts about what others think, say, or do, and we just focus on the task at hand. And we are settled, we are quite content, then we too will be able to have better judgment of what's happening around us and make better decisions in our lives. So this is this idea of being quite considerate, having this good judgment. And back to our example, at this particular stage, you might realize that none of these rules are hard and fast, but can be adapted to the situation. So, for example, if someone new comes to the organization and genuinely wants to learn about how to navigate their way around office politics, and they ask you for advice because they see that you're a person of good character, does that mean that you can't talk to them? Well, actually you can, but you just might be able to talk to them in general principles about sort of the merits and faults of others, but not really talk about specific people. Don't name specific people because everyone changes and we have to give people the time and the space to change, as we would like others to give us the time and the space to change. So you can see here that these guidelines, they're not, they're adaptable to the situation. And at this particular point in time, in this phase, we will be able to be quite flexible and be able to judge the situations better. So this is what it means by this contemplation, and in particular, contemplation of this highest learning. Now, after this point in time, you will actually feel that you've made an improvement. You've made progress on the way. And all of this is, it boosts your confidence and you can do more. So this 6-step process is inevitable. Everyone has to work through it. The fastest learner may progress quite quickly, but others, if they don't give up, slowly and surely will also succeed. So it's just a matter of working your way through and keeping at the goal. Now, we've said that it's a sort of linear process, but in actual fact, as you might have already realized, it's actually more of a cyclical process. So once you feel like you've made progress, feel like, this goal is really easy, it's effortless now, then it's time to move on to something much more challenging, different goal, and then you start the process all over again. So, for example, the next lines in the Deeds of Gwei explain how when you see the faults of others, you should reflect on yourself. When you see the strengths of others, you should try to emulate them. So these are, you could say, two other small goals that we could have. And then, we start this process and keep to the task. So this process, 6-step process, is actually useful not just for goals in the way of the highest learning, but in fact, any of our goals that we have in life, including our New Year's resolutions. So you might ask, well, in the past, I've had these New Year's resolutions, but why is it that they always seem to fail? I don't really fulfill any of them. Well, the answer is probably the first step. Were you clear about what you needed to do? Did you really understand the implications of not changing? Were you aware of the steps to get you there? So this is the very first step. It's so important, knowing this goal. And that's why we need to learn more. So these 4 books help us supplement our practice of whether it's the Deeds of Gwei or another sort of classic text, because they all help each other in terms of the theory and the practice. And when we learn more, we realize what's really at stake. We have all this untapped potential, whether it's our moral excellence, our sensitivity to others, our judgment, our wisdom, and ability to really live life at ease and effortlessly. And that's what's really at stake. If we are clear about the cost-benefit analysis of our lack of change, then we'll be more motivated. So that's where all of this learning comes in, this understanding of the theories and the underlying rationale. So this is the 6-step process that the highest learning provides us with. The next part is really just a summary of what we talked about. So it states, things have their roots and branches, matters have their ends and beginnings. So it's a bit of a metaphor. It talks about a tree having its roots and branches. So obviously, what's the priority in the tree? The roots, right? You can't have the fruits without the roots. So the roots are very important. And in terms of the way of highest learning, it refers to manifesting enlightened virtue. And the branches, which naturally grow from the roots, is what happens when we are able to help others manifest their enlightened virtue, which is loving the people. And that's the roots and branches. Matters then refers to this 6-step process. So we said before, it's actually really a cycle. So when you finish one goal, you start another. And it's this unceasing process. And that's why it says matters have their ends and beginnings. So it's a bit of a summary. I'm using a metaphor. And the next bit, next line, links us to the following passage. So it states, know what is first and follows, and then one approximates the way. So before, when I sort of showed you this diagram, whether it's the cycle or the linear progression, it seemed quite simple. But in fact, in our lives, we have many, many goals, whether it's in our family life or our work life. And we might be on different phases in each of these goals. So it actually can be quite complicated. So how do we prioritize all these different goals? Well, we have to know what comes first and what follows. So that's having priorities. And notice that it says know. So know this. So it's not actually that we've actually practiced it. So it says know our priorities, and then you approximate the way. So when you actually practice it, then you're on the way. But this is simply just approximating. So you just know it, and it's important because that's the first step. You know it, and then you're able to do it. So when you do it, you're on the way to the highest learning. So the next part is quite a long passage, and it brings together these 8 steps or these 8 actions that we talked about last time. So we said that the aims of highest learning is 2, manifesting enlightened virtue, loving the people. Each of these can be further elaborated on using 4 actions, going from the macro level, our thoughts, to the micro level, our thoughts, to the macro level in terms of the global scale. And so in total, there's 8 actions. And how do they all relate? Well, that's what the next passage tells us. So the next passage goes from the macro to the micro. So let's look at this. States, the ancients, wishing to manifest enlightened virtue in the world, would first order their state. In wishing to order their state, would first regulate their household. In wishing to regulate their household, would first cultivate the self. Wishing to cultivate the self, would first rectify their mind. Wishing to rectify their mind, would first make sincere their intention. Wishing to make sincere their intention, would first perfect their knowledge. Perfecting knowledge is in thoughts arising. So it's quite a long line, isn't it? Quite a long sentence. But as you can see here, I've highlighted in red the different levels, starting from the world, then it goes to the level of the individual, and then even our thoughts. And then in blue, I've highlighted the different actions, the verbs, so ordering the state versus cultivating the self versus perfecting our knowledge. So we can see the 8 steps there, can't we? And you can tell from the repetition here, if we just take a step back and look at the sentence structure, it really also does seem like a sequence. So wishing to do A, they would first do B. Wishing to do B, they would first do C, etc., etc. But if we think about it, these are not actually mutually exclusive steps. So what do I mean by this? Is that mutually exclusive steps is when you can not do A until you do B. For example, you can't enter university until you graduate from high school. You can't enter high school until you graduate from primary school. So one has to be before the other. They're mutually exclusive. But here, it doesn't seem like that. And if we just look at this sentence, you'll understand. So in wishing to regulate their household, which is to create harmony within the family, they would first cultivate themselves, their character. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to fully cultivate ourselves, cultivate our character fully before we interact with anyone in the family. Like we have to go to some secluded spot to cultivate ourselves before we go back to our family. Now, if that was the case, it'd be very impractical. And we know, of course, from our own experience that we actually grow up and develop within our family relationships. So what's it telling us? What it is telling us here is that in order to help people around us in our family, we have to think about how to cultivate our own character first, such that we are trustworthy, such that if we say something, they will listen to us, or if we provide a good example, then they can be inspired and emulate, and that would help them too. So the priority is not to control others, to help, regulate them, but to, in fact, think about how we can cultivate ourselves first. So in actual fact, you could think of this as a series of priorities. Now, this is much clearer if we think about articulate in this way. The ancients, wishing to manifest enlightened virtue in the world, would prioritize ordering their state. Then, to order their state, would prioritize regulating their household. And then regulating their household, prioritize cultivating the self, etc. So these are a series of priorities. We have a lot of goals in life, whether it's related to, how our family is, how our physical health, mental health. We might want to make a difference in the world. Well, we have all these goals, but what are the priorities? And this is exactly what this passage tells us, how to make it all fit together, know what comes first and follows. So let's start from the top. So states the ancients. Now, who are the ancients? We think about Confucius, who exists in what we now call early Chinese history. We think of him as being an ancient, right? But in actual fact, this highest learning, this text, provides us with the voice of Confucius and his students. So in fact, it's Confucius or his students looking back in time. So we know that the highest learning compiled in around the Warring States period to the Western Han period. And this is from the 5th century BC to the early years of the 1st century. Now, when they're talking about the ancients, they're talking about the people before this time. So it'd be in the Neolithic period of Chinese history, the Xia dynasty, Shang dynasty, and early Zhou dynasty. Now, when we look at this period, we're talking about a span of several thousands of years. So there's obviously going to be a lot of people during this time, a lot of ancients. Now, who does it refer to in particular? Well, it states here that these ancients wishing to manifest enlightened virtue in the world. So they are on the road to manifesting enlightened virtue, or they also wish to help others manifest enlightened virtue. And that's important because it tells us that these are not just any ordinary person. These people are sages. So these ancient thinkers, ancient rulers who were on the road to manifesting enlightened virtue in the world. So these people provide us with a sense of authority. So by quoting the ancients here, it's telling us it's not just the opinions or views of one person or an organization or a specific group of people, but actually what we're about to read is the practices and the knowledge and the views of series of ancient sages that's been transmitted down to us through various generations throughout Chinese history. Now, when we realize this, we realize how that these ideas have withstood the test of time. They are truly timeless principles. This is wishing to manifest enlightened virtue in the world. Now, in the world is also quite interesting because the Chinese characters literally means all under heaven, which we've translated as the world. But clearly at that time, they hadn't mapped out the world yet. And it probably was referring to the Chinese kingdom. But notice it doesn't talk about the Chinese kingdom here because they also knew at that time that there were people, non-Chinese ethnicities, living beyond the borders of their kingdom. So by using this particular term, all under heaven, it tells us two things. The first is that manifesting enlightened virtue can be achieved by everyone. So, and that's important because this is innate to all humanity. And so these teachings are a cultural heritage for all humanity. The second thing it tells us is that these ancient thinkers knew that there were non-Han or non-Chinese ethnicities, and yet they included them. They didn't just say that this is just for the Chinese people. They said it's for everyone. And to me, that really sort of makes me realize how big-hearted and how this greatness of mind that they have, that they don't just think about their own sort of family and friends, but they think about everyone. And it really, I'd say, inspires us to think big, to dream big, and really make a difference to the world, like these ancient thinkers. So this particular term is quite inspiring. But if we want to make a difference on a global level, how do we go about doing it? And this is what it says what it means when it says manifest enlightened virtue. So it's not just about ending poverty or providing for the material needs of people. That's important, but ultimately manifesting enlightened virtue means that everyone is able to then tap into their moral greatness, this moral excellence. And if that was possible, then they would live in harmony with people around them. They'd be less selfish. And that is actually the root cause of enduring world peace. If everyone would be able to realize their enlightened virtue. So that's why that's the very first line here. And clearly, as we said before, it doesn't say resting in utmost goodness, because manifesting enlightened virtue is the first milestone for everyone. Now, in order to help others manifest enlightened virtue in the world, they would prioritize ordering their state. So clearly, if there are nation states that are at war, or even if there's civil war, it affects the rest of the world. And particularly in the modern day, when it really is a global community. So the ancients would prioritize ordering their state. Now, this refers to good government. And we did sort of explain this last week, how ancient Chinese political philosophy doesn't simply see the government as sort of providing social stability or collecting taxes. So it's not just economic indicators, but rather it was about education and sort of, like it says here, ensuring that this moral excellence can be uncovered. And how do we know this? Well, in another chapter in the Records of Ritual, it states that the ancient kings, in establishing their kingdoms and governing their people, took teaching and learning as the priority. So this is teaching and learning about this innate moral excellence that we have, about tapping in and realizing this enlightened virtue. Now, took teaching and learning as the priority. For who? For the ruler or for the people? Well, clearly both. The ruler has to teach and learn, or learn and teach, because they have to set the example. They have to achieve this greatness, and then, as we saw with the passage from Mencius, if they themselves are rectified or cultivated, then they inspire people around them to cultivate. So clearly it's important for the leader, but it's important for everyone else as well. So this is why it says teaching and learning as the priority. And that was the way in which the states could be ordered, so effectively governed. To order their state, they would prioritize regulating their household. Now, the household refers to the family, but here during this period of time, it's referring to rather large, sort of extended families. In this period of time, large or powerful families in the state actually had not only political and economic power, but they also had military power. So if we see here, there's two maps. If you look on the left, the circle is in the middle is this rather large state called Jing. And if you look on the right side map, you'll see that the state of Jing no longer exists. It's been split up into three states, Zhao, Wei, Han. And these three states were originally the three most powerful families in the state of Jing. Now, what they did was they just carved up the state. And this partitioning of the state of Jing marked the transition from what we'd call the spring and autumn period to the warring states period in China, in Chinese history, which occurred in around the 5th century BCE. So clearly these families are very powerful. And if there's disharmony or if there's conflict, then this really has consequences for the state itself, these nation states. So in terms of the family, let's discuss this concept. When we think about the family today, we think about a nuclear family, so parents and children living together. But in Chinese history, yes, there were nuclear families, but the extended families also played a very significant part. So there were two sort of configurations. The first is that of the family lineage, and these were families descended from a common ancestor, living together with common property and wealth. And then there were family clans, which were sort of a federation of lineages, tracing back to a much more distant ancestor, but still all of the same surname. And what's interesting about these family setups is that they were very significant in society, in the sense they provided what we now call government welfare services. So in these extended families, the healthy and able-bodied would care for the ill and infirm. The young family members would provide resources and security for the old and retired. These families would set up a sort of village or family school so that the younger generations could be educated. They would have an ancestral hall so that kinship ties would be celebrated. And they even stipulated family rules and regulations so that everyone sort of had the same values. So we'd see that it was a very sort of well-regulated or quite structured setup. And just to give you an idea of this family-centeredness and the sort of tracing back to the family roots, there's a very interesting genre of texts in sort of pre-modern China called the family genealogies. I don't know if anyone has ever seen their own family genealogy, but this one is actually of the Xu family clan, and it's actually 6 volumes, so it's quite extensive. And when you look in the text, these family genealogies, you'll see that they have, amongst other things, there's a lot of information, but there's these generational descent charts. And the Xu family clan traces back to the Zhuan Xu, who lived in the Neolithic period, and they trace back to their founding patriarch, Ruomu, who was conferred the Xu province for his service in mitigating the floodwaters at that time, quite a natural disaster. So this surname, Xu, comes from the name of the province, and that was very common in those days to take the province name as the surname. And throughout the rest of the text, it sort of lists out the various generations. For example, here it's listed down to the 17th generation. And it's actually quite detailed because it doesn't just provide names of the sort of heads of these families, but also details about their place and date of birth and death and their children, etc., and even provides portraits of very eminent members of the family throughout time. So by reading this, you would get this real sense of family pride and this sense of belonging to your family. Importantly, in these documents, they also have household regulations, lineage covenants, family instructions. Now, this particular page here is not a family instruction, but it's the instructions of the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty who ruled in the 14th century. You can see there's six instructions, very simple, and it relates to traditional values. For example, being filial to parents, respecting elders, being harmonious in the community, teaching the youth, being responsible and not committing offences. So nothing too difficult. But what's interesting is that this family thought that it was very significant to be sort of recorded in their own family genealogy. And the following pages actually provide clarification on these instructions. So not only did they record them, they also explained them. And that's because these sorts of instructions, whether it's the family instructions or sort of imperial instructions, were really the basis of what we mean by regulating the household. So by providing these ideas, these values, then everyone had the same values. By providing a school, prioritizing or placing importance in these in education, particularly ethical teachings, then from a young age, the family members would have these values. So an example of one of these ethical teachings that's taught right from elementary learning is the 5 fundamental relationships. And 3 of these relationships are in the family. So between partners, between parent and child, and between siblings. So for example, the parent must care, but not spoil the child, and the child must learn to respect and also care for their parents. So by learning about these various roles and your responsibilities in them, then it means that everyone knows what they need to do when they navigate through the very complex family structure. So you could be a parent, you could be a son, you could be a sibling, all at the same time. And you have to know how to relate to the people around you. So that's why these teachings are so important. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but do you think that it'd be more difficult to manage or run a family with 100 people or a company of 100 people? Which one would be more difficult? Probably the family. And why is that? Because the members of the family have these sort of deep-seated histories and associations between them. And, if someone does something wrong, you can't fire them. You also can't invoke the law every time there's a conflict between members. You have to deal with it in a much more emotionally intelligent way because you have to be sensitive to the fallout of of your decisions, because everyone still has to live together. So it's actually much more difficult. And you can see why, of course, these teachings from an early age, the sort of family structure, including even the genealogy, these values are so important. Now, having said that, when we talk about regulating the household, in a modern setting, that could also be thought of as an organization or a large corporation. Because these days, of course, we live in nuclear families. And most of our lives, most of our day is spent in these rather large organizations. And these organizations also have specific values, professional standards, and regulations. So regulating the household these days could also mean this regulating and creating order within an organization. So, and just to sort of let you know about this, sort of thinking about the relevance in today's life. So that's regulating the household. Next, it tells us, in wishing to regulate their household, they would prioritize cultivating the self. So whether it's a family or an organization, it's made up of individuals. And each individual has to be very clear, as we said before, about their roles and responsibilities and what they need to fulfill to be part of this team, this family, or this organization. Interestingly, this particular character, cultivate, xiu in Chinese, originally meant to clean and clear, but not our physical appearance, rather our moral character. So to cultivate our character. And we do this, as I mentioned, by understanding our responsibilities and through our words and actions. And I guess the key to this within the family setting or the organization is to always focus on your own responsibilities. Don't demand or expect anything from others, because oftentimes those expectations may not be fulfilled. We may be over demanding. So cultivating the self involves focusing on yourself and fulfilling your own responsibilities, and then being a role model for others. Now, I've taken this particular passage from the Analects because I think it helps us think about this in a different way. So in this passage, Confucius is talking about certain rites or ceremonies that occurred regularly in the past. So, for example, ancestral commemoration. And he says, you've got these ceremonies, but is it just a matter of these jade sort of ritual vessels, like all these implements and sort of ceremonial vessels that we see? And is it just a matter of the silk ceremonial robes that we wear? In terms of the music, is it just the bells and drums, like the instruments? Well, clearly not, because what's more important is not what we wear and the actual ceremony, but our attitude in that ceremony. So interestingly, ritual is not just confined to these elaborate ceremonies, but actually has a very broad scope, including our everyday etiquette, our social conduct, how we relate to others, how we actually sort of our own personal deportment even. And so if we think about it in this way, this sort of social etiquette, is it just a matter of going through the motions, saying our pleases and thank yous? It's actually about being genuine. And there's no point sort of putting on appearances, because everyone can tell that it's quite superficial, and you're not doing yourself any favors because you're not actually cultivating yourself. So it's not about learning the polite words or the polite sort of conduct. It's actually about the genuineness inside. And that's what makes this or the etiquette work. So you can see here very clearly that cultivating the self goes back to what's in our minds. So that's where we head to next. Now, before that we do that, let's take stock of the various levels that we've already worked through. We've talked about the world, we've talked about the state, the household or organization, and then finally cultivating the self. Now, these 4 actions are related to the aim of loving the people, and that's in a way this external world, what we see outside. And now we're talking about how it relates to the internal world and the 4 actions in manifesting the enlightened virtue, our mind, our thoughts, etc. So let's take a look at how they're related. As we said, cultivating the self is not about the words or the actions or our appearance, our dress. It's about our mind. And that's because the mind is the master of the body. What we think comes out in what we say and what we do. So we have to be in the right headspace before we can really cultivate our character. And interestingly, in Chinese philosophy, the character for mind is also often translated as heart. It's called the heart mind, because there's no sort of duality between our emotions and our reasoning mind. It sort of comes together in Chinese philosophy that these emotions actually have an effect on our reasoning mind, our rational mind, our thoughts and our views, etc. And just to give you an example of how all these things connect from our mind to what we say and what we do, and then ultimately our relationships. There's a very good example, again from the Deeds of Grace. It states, when siblings value family ties more than possessions, resentment will not arise. So it's telling us that in our mind, we have to value, we have to cherish belonging in this sibling relationship more than our physical belongings. And if we can do that, that changes what we say and what we do if, for example, we find that our sibling has damaged our phone. So you can see how what we value affects our emotions, which then affects what we say and what we do, which then affects our relationship with others. And it's just from this idea of rectifying the mind. But clearly this concept of the mind is still quite hazy. And so that's why there's a need to hone down and talk about this intention. So what's the intention? It's where our thoughts are directed. It's where our mind is directed at any particular point in time. It's our purpose, you could say, or our motivation. So just to give you an example, during the day in the morning, we have to go to work or go to school. But before we go to work, we have to, eat breakfast, pack our bags, maybe take the train or the bus or walk there. So we have to do a lot of things in between. All that time we're thinking. But that never changes our intention, which is to go to school or go to work. So that's sort of the overarching purpose that we have. And so this is the intention. that directs our mind. But clearly, as you can see, our intentions are related to our knowledge and ultimately the thoughts that arise at any particular moment. So that's really the last level. As it states here, wishing to make sincere their intention, they would prioritize perfecting their knowledge. Perfecting knowledge is in thoughts arising. So this last part, perfecting knowledge is in thoughts arising, is clearly the most important priority. And not surprisingly, throughout Chinese history, we've had various interpretations of what thoughts arising really means. So Professor Li Bingnan extracted 4 of these commentaries, what scholars have said in the past, and he sort of explains them before he provides his own interpretation. And so it states here, perfecting knowledge is in Ge, and Ge is that in Chinese, what we've translated as thoughts arising. But how did we get there? Well, if we look at the earliest commentary, Zheng Xuan, he says that we have to perfect knowledge of what's good and bad. And how do we do that is by reflecting on the matters we encounter. So if we experience misfortune, then we reflect on the fact that that's probably because we've had unkind, mean thoughts. If we encounter good fortune, then that's when we reflect, likely related to the good thoughts we've had. Now, understanding that, we perfect our knowledge of what's good and bad, and therefore we do more good things, like we think more kind thoughts. So that was his idea of the fact that perfecting knowledge is in reflecting on the matters we encounter. The historian Sima Guang pointed out a weakness in this argument. He said, yes, we know what's right and wrong, but why is it that we don't always do what's right? We do what's wrong, and then we regret, etc. So he said that perfecting knowledge is not just in knowing, but it's actually in resisting material desires. So he says that we can't do what's right because we're tempted by these things outside, whether it's fame, money, or even just sensory gratification. So that's what we have to do. We have to resist material desires, and in that way we can perfect our knowledge. So still very much looking and reflecting on ourselves. Zhu Xi talked about perfecting knowledge of the underlying principle in everything in the universe. And he said that in order to do this, perfecting this knowledge is in investigating the underlying principle of everything. So texts, conversations, matters, etc. So it's very much looking at sort of external things and trying to theorize about what's the underlying principle. Now, 15th century philosopher Wang Yangming tried this out. He tried to investigate the underlying principle of bamboo trees. He sat in front of bamboo trees for 7 days, 7 nights. Not only did he not succeed, but he also got quite sick. And it was at this time that he realized that, well, maybe what Zhu Xi said is probably not achievable. And later in life, he revised this definition or this idea of Ge. So he says that perfecting knowledge, this is perfecting our innate knowledge, our innate wisdom. Realizing this innate wisdom is in rectifying our selfish thoughts. So rectifying or correcting our selfish desires, being more selfless. And that relates to what Sima Guang was saying. Now, bringing all of these ideas together, Professor Li Bingnan talked about the idea, looked at this meaning of Wu, this particular Chinese character, and he says, well, it's not necessarily these physical objects, sort of what Zhu Xi said, external objects, because if you look at something in the classic, the Zhuo's commentary to the Spring and Autumn Annals, we see that this particular character really refers to just a mark. So it's an impression of something, an idea. It's not really something physical. And that's why he said that Ge, perfecting our knowledge, occurs in the thoughts that arise. Now, how does this work? Well, every moment throughout the day, we have millions, if not, a lot of thoughts, countless thoughts. We might not even realize. Now, when these thoughts arise, we have to recognize them. We have to identify them and evaluate them. Are they for the self, for ourselves, in other words, selfish, or are they selfless? Are they for the benefit of others? Now, if they are for the benefit of others, then this is good. We should continue. If it's not for the benefit of others, it's selfish reasons, then we should stop that thought in its tracks. And if we can do that, then our intentions will be sincere, our mind will be rectified, and will be cultivated. So let's look at a worked example. In a particular guideline, states, before we ask others to do something, we should first ask ourselves if we will do it. If not, then we should not ask others to do it. So what's this thought here? The thought is, I want to ask someone to do something. So this thought arises. We have to perfect our knowledge. We have to question it. Is this something for myself or something that is for the benefit of others? I mean, am I just asking someone to do something because I don't want to do it? I want to avoid the work. It's too hard, it's too messy, too complicated. And I don't want to do it, so I'll just push it on to someone else. So you recognize that thought, that I am trying to avoid work for my own sake. And then if that's the case, then we should not ask someone to do it. In other words, we should not continue that thought. And then the intentions will be sincere, etc. So you can see how when these thoughts arise, they often go unchecked in our mind. And then that leads to our words, our actions, our emails, etc. And we haven't done that step of perfecting the knowledge and clearly not recognizing that the thought has arisen. So these first two actions are so important. And it really is the very crux of this 8-step process. So very quickly and briefly, of course, we have covered all of the 8 steps. And we can see that there are a series of priorities from if we want to make a difference, we prioritize the state, etc., etc. And we read in the first line that the ancients wanted to manifest enlightened virtue in the world. They wanted to help everyone. Well, what did they have to prioritize? They had to prioritize manifesting enlightened virtue for themselves. And how did they do that? Through their each and every thought. By recognizing, identifying the thoughts were arising and perfecting that knowledge, then they were able to be sincere, they would be able to cultivate the self and really make a difference to everyone, the people around them. So you'd see that this whole process is not something that is unattainable. In fact, manifesting enlightened virtue is very practical. It can be done in every moment, in every part of our day, from our work life to our family life. And that's by simply evaluating what's going on in our heads, being clear-headed, not being clouded by our emotions. So it's very realizable. And we also can think about that 6-step process in trying to, I guess, change and trying to perfect our knowledge. We can go through the 6-step process of changing these habits of thought. So that's how it all sort of comes together, all of these actions and all of these steps. We'll end there today, but next week we'll cover these 8 steps in more detail because that is also the next passage, particularly the first and the most important priority, which is about these thoughts arising and how we can really use it in our lives so that we can have more fulfilling lives and realize this innate excellence that we all have. So thank you very much and look forward to seeing you next week.